Great. Okay, so welcome everyone for coming along to this talk tonight. I'm the Vice President of ASHA, the Australasian Society for Historical Archaeology, and they are co-hosting this event with us here today. I'll let Martin, who will be mostly introducing the talk today, I'll let you kind of introduce the project and what we're generally doing. But I would like to just start by saying we have a range of presenters. So I'm Caitlin DeGlewis, we've got Martin Gibbs, Richard Tuffin, and David Roberts. Hello. He's also just walking through the door. Good timing. Great work. And this work is also supported by Marie Evans and Tom Sapienza from Carver, who also are collaborating with us on the project. So we'll mention them a little bit later on through the talk. So thank you, ASHA, for supporting this event. And we hope those online, hello, enjoy the talk as well. And I will introduce Martin to begin. Yes.
Could we figure out how to get the strip off the screen?
Oh, yes. Oh, okay. Let me see if I can work that out. How do I? Now you tell me that's there. I think it will just, there we
Yay.
Make that small and out of the way. It needs to go a bit further down. Oh, now making it worse.
Long gone. Yeah.
Sorry. I think it should just hide itself.
There are days that I dream of a chalkboard and sometimes a slide projector. But since I started teaching when, the worst thing in the world was to be changing your slide and you heard that crunch.
There we go.
I knew that it was going to go down.
Katie, we've lost you on our screen though.
Oh, okay. That's why. Okay, hold on. Now I need to get my mouse back. Sorry, we thought we were ready to go. And then, can anyone see? Oh, there we go. Mouse is back. Hello. Right, back to sharing. Share that with you. It's back again. Hello. Good.
Yep, it's back.
I'm just going to leave
That's
that.
fine. That's it. Let's.
Great.
Go for
Okay.
that.
Sorry about that. Technical difficulty. Take it away.
Hello, everybody. And I'm going to add to the hi. So no, you came with me. You don't have to say hi. I'm going to do a great big shout out right now to Lisa Richards, who actually in many ways started this version of the archaeology that we're doing. So thanks very much, Lisa. It would be nice if Janelle Blucher had been here, but Janelle's still in somewhere around Parramatta, I imagine. So there, but also right from the get-go, an enormous shout out to Rob Varman. So in 2014, when we actually first came here at the invitation of Lisa and Janelle, we were working with Robert, who many of you will have known personally and others will have read his work. The intention was that we would essentially kick back into some of the work that Robert had been doing and pull it together with a sort of a new spin on convicts. Unfortunately, after the first year, Robert just said, I'm not feeling very well. And then he had a series of personal family difficulties and then passed away. So, I think we'd like to recognize that we are building on Robert's work here. Okay. Oh, hi, people on the screen. I completely forgot you were there. That's terrible. Since I work in an online university, I should know how to do this. If only I can make the slides change. Use the...
You should just be able
Yay! Okay, Katie is also my time manager. So when she starts doing this, followed by, I know I've got to get off. What I want to make as a point about this is what we think we know about convicts probably depends on when you went to primary school. So I'm a child from the 60s. I went to primary school in the 70s, and the story is very much torn between either it was all the lash and this and that, or it was the happy little convict with Rolf Harris, which has its own creepy element to it these days. But really, we have to keep on saying, what do we actually know about what convicts did? It's now much more acceptable, of course, to actually be interested in convicts rather than, hide them under the bed. And there's a thing that's called convict chic. We're not going to deal with that today. We are going to, hopefully, talk about a project that we've been doing for about the last 10 years called Landscapes of Production and Punishment. And I suppose if you want to read that, you're very welcome. What it comes down to is we want to get people beyond the idea that convicts are all locked up in prisons. They're not. That's not the ideology. The ideology at the time for punishment reform was you made them work. And there were instances you could make them work from their cell. But really, they were like every government enterprise. They were going, yes, we could lock them up, but we could also make money from them. We could make them pay for themselves. We could even get some profit out of it. So this title, Landscapes of Production and Punishment, is all about this weird tension within the convict system for we should be reforming them, but we also want to make cash out of them, but we should be punishing them. But if we punish them, they're not going to work very well. So all of those things are on the go. So the way that we approach the convict system, there are many angles which we're going to go through, is we're trying to look at it as more of an industrial system. You know, we're interested in the labour that the convicts did, but particularly we're interested in how convicts both physically and metaphorically moved through the system, through a whole series of places, and by consequence, because we're archaeologists, the sites that they worked, what those sites were like, how they changed over time, and how the sites over here compare to the sites over there. So just keep that in mind because it will come up a few times and there will be a test. Now, there are many components to the project, and one of them is that we work with historians for our sins. No, sorry, I just said that for Dave there. And the historians particularly have been going back through the record sets. Now that we have this wealth of online digital resource, everything is being digitized and is available, and transcribing them, and particularly for the historians, doing two main veins. One is to extract all this interesting information about their biometrics and how old people were, what their health status was, what their skills were, what the convictions were, and so on. But particularly starting to trace out life courses and relationships. Now, I will say we're not going to have lots and lots of text. There's just a couple of slides. Dave, when he talks, is going to talk a little bit about that in relation to Norfolk Island. The other thing we have to think about is that convicts were part of a system. They were moving either up or down, up towards freedom or down towards, if they are naughty enough, being hung. So this is a sort of an all-purpose fit schema. And the two phases of Norfolk Island, of course, we're going to talk about is first settlement and second settlement. It is not a history lesson. I think everyone here already knows the history of Norfolk Island, so we don't need to redo that. But I'm going to introduce this distinction of a settlement with convicts versus a convict settlement. And I'll unpack that a little bit later. But the big thing when you look at these charts is say, wow, there's all of these stages, all of these places. So the question I put to everyone is, well, where are they? You know, we chiefly say this, that, stockade, prison, work gang, blah. Where in the actual physical landscape do these things exist? But more to the point, how do they all operate together as part of a system? What do I mean by part of a system? Well, again, hold on to that thought. So one of the first jobs we do as archaeologists is we go through existing reports, whether they're archaeological reports, historical documents, look for all the mentions of convict places. We put them into a database, but particularly we start to spatialize them. We try to figure out from looking at the documents, historic maps, plans, whatever, literally where they are on that ground surface. Because as archaeologists, we need to go out and then find them. So we do a lot of these things. These maps are available online for free. If you put in convict landscapes, you can have access to these maps. So we put them all out there with the information on when the sites are. And it's a sort of an ever-evolving system. So you can search by whatever type of site you're interested in and so on. Oh, wrong direction. You can see there's a time slider that shows you when certain sites are in certain places and so on. I'm just showing this off more to give you the idea that we're doing, we've got a big master data set, which is immediately available to family historians, people of interest, and there is a special Norfolk section in that as well. Now, what I said is like we're interested in the relationship of sites to each other. We were interested in the flow of people and goods between places. What does that mean? I gave a talk for the bicentenary of Brisbane only a few months ago. Dave Roberts was there as well. Caiti was there as well. And very quickly put together this example just to illustrate. So we did that databasing process, went through a whole bunch of historical documents to find where all the different sites were, and just tried to make the point that, you know, there are many different types of convict place in that landscape. So there's the main settlements. So Redcliffe was the original version of Brisbane, which then gets abandoned. Brisbane being Moreton Bay, I should say. There are workstations where they do industrial activities. There are specialised workstations such as timber camps. There's lots of farms and cattle stations all over that landscape. There's stone quarrying camps and lime burning camps. Now, these are just the major sites, because around each of those sites, there are landscapes. So those stations are the node from which the convicts are sent out to do the work. And then they come back and stay there. So we're not really interested in prisons. We're interested in these places as places where convicts do work. But it's more than that. So you've got those landscapes around. Timber getting. In this case, they're timber getting up and down along the rivers. We then have to start thinking about the logistics. How do they get these agricultural products, you know, whatever, back to the station that processes them, then back to where they're taken to the rest of the colony? Because once again, that government enterprise isn't just about feeding convicts. They're going to try to feed the rest of the colony by the labour of the convicts. Okay, so, you know, a lot of this is by the river systems. As I said, many, many, many more sites in there. We haven't even factored in the military control mechanisms, all sorts of things like that. Okay, so how do we do these things? And I'm going to invite Richard to talk a little bit about how we have actually gone out and found those types of sites and what these sorts of places look like. So this is not about Norfolk Island particularly. This is, in fact, primarily the work we do in Tasmania. So if I hand over to Rich.
Hello. Yeah, so what we were really interested in when we began this 2017 ARC project is the question of where were the convicts? Where were they living and where were they labouring? And this project was focused on the Tasman Peninsula. So all these examples I'm going to show you are drawn from our historical and our archaeological research. And I want to sort of also draw it back to what we could do at Norfolk and how this fieldwork on the peninsula can really feed into what we're going to learn about when we do this project on Norfolk Island. So what you're seeing here is a project that we did looking at the landscape of Port Arthur. So Martin said we were really interested in the hinterland of what was going on around these places. Well, this is very much focusing on the main settlement. So you'll see that web map evolving there. And as Martin said, you can access that to see what was going on. And we were just answering a really basic question of where were the buildings at Port Arthur? You know, Port Arthur is a very well-trafficked site. Lots of visitors, lots of study has been done there. But when we began the project, we realised even simple questions about where buildings were, what they were over the 47 years of convict occupation hadn't been answered. So we were able to put together this web map to show where those buildings were. You can go on site, use it to locate your way around the place. And like this type of thing is really applicable to what's going on at the sites on Norfolk Island as well. But what you'll also see on the right-hand side there are conduct records. And what we worked out is about 15% of conduct records, so these are the documents which record a convict's behaviour in the convict service, about 15% of them were able to be located to a space at the convict station and also a place in time. So when you know where they are in time and where they are in place, you can put them on a map such as this. So what we did was digitize these records and then put them into the landscape of Port Arthur. So if you knew where the 1837 blacksmith was and you know that someone committed an offence there, you can go to that exact spot today in the landscape and stand where this person had committed that offence. And so what we're able to do is put hundreds of the offences because they're basically moments captured in time by the authorities. You know, lots of other things were happening, but they weren't always documented. And the conduct records are really good for that. And of course, we can do this type of thing at all places around Australia and Norfolk Island, of course. So that was the main things that we really started with. But when we wanted to expand it to the hinterland of the convict stations, what we wanted to do as archaeologists was really engage with that landscape. So what we were doing was using a tool called LiDAR, which is light detection and ranging. And basically, a plane flies over, shoots out millions of laser pulses and maps the landscape for us. So you can just see that's all those little points there from the LiDAR. We turn it into what's called a digital elevation model. And then from that, we can create a hillshade model. And this is a landscape on the Tasman Peninsula at Cascades, which was a convict timber getting station operational in the 1840s. So during the probation period, exactly the same time that Norfolk Island is really kicking off during that settlement period. And what you can see here is a landscape absolutely full of timber getting infrastructure. And I'll just show you here. This is that same area with all of that vegetation cover on. So what the LiDAR does is it penetrates that vegetation, maps the landscape to a really, really high degree, and we can actually then look for things in the landscape. And if I press that button, this is that hillshade LiDAR. And what you can see there, all those dots are saw pits. So just in this very, very small landscape, we found 64 convict period saw pits, all within about 3 square kilometres. And they had a series of tramways, sneak tracks for bringing the timber down, the sawmill, and then tracks for the convicts walking back to the main settlement, because further north or up from this picture was the main settlement. And so what we're able to do is look at how these convicts interacted with the landscape. And one thing we were really interested in is, well, we have all these rules and regulations which talk about, oh, the convicts had dinner at this time, lunch at this time, tea at this time. But when they're out in the landscape, this is about 2 miles away from the main settlement. They have to walk from the station to these places of work. And we worked out, that's about 45 minutes, and particularly more if they're wearing leg irons, because a lot of the men here were wearing leg irons because it was a punishment station. So you're looking at the time economy of these places. So they're walking to this place. It takes them about an hour and a half round trip just to get back to the station. So that made us think, well, of course, they're not going back to the station for lunch, because often the regulations said that these convicts would go back for lunch. These guys weren't going back for lunch. They'd be doing it all out in the landscape. And that meant when we found some archaeological returns for platforms and things, what we're probably looking at are things like hut sites where these men would have been having their breaks and things like that. So it helps us really interrogate the records, because they say one thing, the landscape tells us something else. And what's really interesting is I've been doing some cursory work just looking at the LiDAR for Norfolk Island with Tom, and we can see some sites that possibly are saw pits around here. But we've done work at Port Arthur, Maria Island, and they're very different landscapes to this Cascades probation station, which has always saw pits. Port Arthur doesn't really. And you hear about Port Arthur being a big timber getting station. Maria Island off the east coast of Tasmania, also one where they did a lot of timber getting, hardly any saw pits. And the same is also at Norfolk. I haven't seen that many saw pit signatures out there in the landscape. So either we're looking at stuff that the LiDAR is not picking up that well, we haven't been able to ground truth it yet, or like at Port Arthur and Maria, we're looking at different types of timber getting. Because what happens here, Cascades, they're felling the trees, refining them at the point of fall, and then because they've got tramways, they're putting the produced timber that they've done in these big saw pits and taking it back to the settlement. But you think about Port Arthur, Norfolk, they're using those centipede gangs, so those big carrying gangs, and what they can do is they can fell the tree, delimit, turn it into a beam without having to dig a saw pit, and then they can carry it back to a place to like the lumber yards at Norfolk and then work on it there. So you see a very different landscape signature to what's going on. So what we're interested in is looking at that extra landscape out there to see, well, what does that tell us about the type of labour that's happening here? Another thing that LiDAR can do for us is quantify the labour that's actually happening. So what this image, which is hopefully translating okay, which it is a 3D rendering of a huge sandstone quarry that's about 3/4 of a mile to the west of the main Port Arthur site. And what we were able to work out is that these guys, we can do what's called a volumetric analysis and work out how much stone has been taken out of this quarry. And we worked out there's about 24,000 cubic meters of, cubic meters of stone has come out of this quarry. And we worked out that that breaks down to about 80,000 man days. And what we're able to do with that is look at these things, which are labour returns. And there are quite a lot of these I've found for Norfolk Island, where what the authorities do is quantify how much labour is meant to go into a day's work. So they think, oh, a half a yard of stone should be cut by a convict who's in class 3, as opposed to class 1 who does a different type of labour. So the authorities had this idea about what a convict could do, and we can take that and then look at the landscape such as that quarry and do some math to work out, well, if there's 24,000 cubic metres of stone, Well, that probably took that amount of time. So this hole in the landscape, which is, fun and lovely to record as an archaeologist, we can actually also begin to learn more about the labour. And what's really interesting is you can take that analysis type and begin to look at things like, so on the right here, you've got some big clay pits at Port Arthur, and on the left, you've got those saw pits from Cascades that I was talking about. So these are all things that convicts had to labour to do. So like the saw pits on the left, when we did volumetric analysis from the LiDAR, we worked out that some of these pits would have taken, they're in sandy soil, so easy digging. These would have taken like 5 days to dig. And that's sort of labour you don't really think about that's encapsulated in this landscape. And when we look at the clay pits, again, how much spoil and how much clay comes out, we're able to work out that these produced about 3 million bricks just from that. And again, we have records which do talk about brick production, but being able to see on the ground how much is actually coming out just from the holes that are left in the ground is really, really nice indication of the labour cost and the output that's going into these convict landscapes. And of course, there's these type of things all over the place. You can do that with tramways, you can do that with the road systems that are around. This all takes labour, and we can begin to really look at how much effort has to go into that. Another landscape is Maria, which I just mentioned off the east coast of Tassie. And Martin and myself did an Australian Heritage Grant over the last couple of years, looking at Darlington, which is in the north there. You can see at the tip of the island. And we also did one at Long Point, which is sort of in the middle, just about there. And Long Point was a big agricultural station in the 1840s, again, contemporaneous with Norfolk. And as we all know, second settlement at Norfolk is very much all about agriculture. Agriculture everywhere is what they were doing, because the convict system is all about being as self-sufficient as possible, because especially with a place like Norfolk, you don't want to bring that stuff in. Shipping costs lots of time and money. You want to grow it where you can. So hence, they really pushed agriculture. And it was the same with places like Maria Island here. So this is just a little rendering, again, using LiDAR information of the Long Point station. And you can see just the configuration of it there. We've got the convict station, which was built in about 1844. You've got the military barracks, and you also have these agricultural sites that are happening here. And if I move that on it, so what we had here was big fields of wheat being grown. So what they needed was a mill building. So we had a post mill, much like was had here. And you can see the site of that post mill there, just as that circle. You had the miller's cottage, and all around that was cultivation happening, wheat growing. And we're able to actually look at the ground, see the signatures in the ground from the LiDAR, so where the cultivation is actually taking place, rig and furrow, things like that, and work out that those yellow areas are all where the convicts were actually doing their cultivation. And again, particularly because we're interested in the time economy of these places, we're able to work out some of these places about 4 kilometres from the station. So again, just think about the labour effort of going out from your station to that place of work and coming back. Sometimes they'd have an outstation where the people could stay, but in this particular case, they were going to and from the station every day. So lots of effort. And up the top right there, it's hard to see, but in the LiDAR, we were picking up things called rig and furrow. So if you've travelled at all to like Scotland or the uplands of England, you'd be very familiar with these cultivation patterns, which are just furrowing in the ground. And now that is often, particularly in Scotland, associated with the growing of root vegetables, because Scotland's quite wet, so you need to sort of bring your vegetables up and out the ground. And we had very familiar patterns here of rig and furrow, and that is because there was a lot of potatoes and root veg being grown here. And I've had a look on the LiDAR here for Norfolk, and we also have very similar rig and furrow patterns happening in other places, which probably signify that type of cultivation. Because again, you get returns which talk about the growing of vegetables by the commissariat, but you often don't know where in the ground this is growing. And it's really interesting to look at where that's occurring, and then look at the climatic conditions which might encourage that, and why the convict service picked those areas, because these guys know what they're doing. Right? They are being run by men who know the system. They know what they're doing as regards agriculture. They're just not putting stuff in and just hoping it grows. So they have these very intricate systems running. It's really interesting to look at that landscape in operation. And there's some potatoes, just in case you don't know what they look like. And also associated with these landscapes, which are also very medieval in their way. They're just full of these big stone piles. Now, I don't know if there's many of this happening around the island here, lots of big clearance cans. But we found about 320 clearance cans just in this small area. And again, I keep on harping about this hidden labour cost that's going into these landscapes. So imagine you having to clear the fields, and all those red dots signify a mound which is from 2 meters up to 10 meters wide. And you've got to clear these fields, make these mounds, and then go back and do the cultivation. It's just this labor effort that you don't think about in the landscape that's there. So again, just vast amounts of effort going into these places. And that's Martin there, using for scale.
Thank you. Got another hug. I know what you're aiming for.
Yeah, and just quickly, that's the site of the mill there. So there's just some low res photogrammetry just showing on the left there. You've got the barn for the mill, and then that circle there is the base of the post mill, and it's out at Long Point. It's beautiful preservation on the ground. You can see the circle where it was, and you can see where the cross beams were in the ground. And there's a nice illustration there of a post mill, which was at Darlington. So just all part of that agricultural landscape. And just finally, another thing that we've done with these landscapes, and again, this is Tasman Peninsula, Port Arthur, we can query it for how the authorities and the convicts interacted with the large scale landscape. So what you're looking at here is what's called a viewshed analysis. So this is the darker blue areas where if you were standing, you would have view to 2 semaphores. So semaphores are a way of signalling back and forth. As far as I'm aware, there were some semaphores here as well as flag staffs. So they're ways of conveying information over long distances and quite quickly. Now, I don't know if at Norfolk, but at Port Arthur, these semaphores also had a time ball. So they would drop at certain points during the day just to sort of let you know what was going on, what time it was during the day, if it was midday or something like that. And so if you think about it, this viewshed shows if you could see 2 or 1 semaphore, either at Port Arthur itself or up on a hill. This one was up on a large mountain called Mount Arthur. It covers most of that landscape. And you can see where these sites of labour are. You've got charcoal burning, timber getting, quarrying. And these semaphores all control the routine. So you think, how did the overseers and the gangs know when to bring the convicts back? If something was going on, how would they be informed? Well, it's these semaphores that are doing that. So they cast this veil of control over the landscape. And we can do that type of thing here because we have all this information for, you know, the topography of Norfolk, and we know where flagstaffs were, we know where semaphores were, and you can begin to drape this over the landscape of Norfolk Island just to see how the authorities and the convicts all sort of interacted with this landscape. And I think that's on to your stuff now.
Thanks. So hopefully you're getting the idea. It's not that we're not interested in the prisons, but the prisons are just one component of labour management. The convicts are out there. All of those things are convict sites, you know, and this is what we're missing because it's easy to think, oh, you know, it's just a quarry. No, that's where the convicts were. That's where the convicts were labouring. That's where the convicts were, if you like, being punished. But also, that's where the convicts were learning skills, which they would then take with them when they're emancipated. They may not have come in as a shoemaker, but they sure as hell go out as one. So there's all this complexity in it. So I'm not going to give you the history lesson. In fact, I'm going to go backwards from Second Settlement to just give you an idea of some of the thoughts we've got. And I heard some of you while Rich was talking going, yeah, I know about that. Now, the vision that we have of that convict system is, of course, as I said, the lash and the chain gangs. And if there was ever a place it was going to happen, yeah, Norfolk Island is the one. But let's just look at a couple of the really well-known images that we've got of Norfolk Island. And we do a lot of this, but I'm just going to do 1 or 2. There's industry everywhere. They're not hanging around the cells. Sorry, online people. They are out and about in that landscape. So the logged slopes, they're significant. That's where the timber's coming from. There are quarries around the edges. I love the hand-drawn cart. Remember, this denial of animal labour is important because it's punitive. They're carrying the logs. They're carrying the stone, or they're dragging it along and so on. The saw pit just tucked away in the corner. The fields. Just to throw in another one from McConaughey. The post mill, very similar to the type that you saw on Maria Island. The lime kilns, of course. There's people fishing out there. But what I love, and I always forget, is there's the work gangs being walked up and down outside of the barracks to those places of labour as well. And you can do this again and again. every stone in a building is convict labor. I was going to say every brick, but not on Norfolk, really. No, you know, the bricks are terrible. So keep on bearing that in mind. But it's everything from that hard gang labor to raw material extraction to quite complex manufacturing as well. And those roles are played differently, and it depends on who you are. So the convict system is hungry for skilled people. They want the brute force, but they want the skills as well, because, you know, they have to deal with who is coming through that system as part of that flow if they want certain things done. Otherwise, they have to hire people and pay for it. In fact, they do pay for it, because if they don't deal with the convicts well, they just refuse to work. So that's the core industrial hub, if you like, around Kingston. But as you all know, the whole island is an industrial landscape. So these, again, are the major sites. So this is from the Arrowsmith 1841 map. Anyone who wants to copy these things, I'm happy to give you these pictures as well. But just to give you an idea of this complex of sheep stations and cattle stations and semaphore systems and police stations to monitor who's going where and what. And this is why you need the semaphores. Because if you've got a big industrial network, they need to know what each other is doing. So people say, oh, semaphores, they're for signaling ships. Yeah, they do that. But more regularly, they're actually coordinating industrial activity. So what do the outstations look like? Well, you'll all probably know the image of Longridge. And again, I love the convicts working. You'd think it was an English agricultural scheme, but it's not. These are convicts at labour in the fields, gathering up the hay. When you look at the complexity of Longridge, I mean, it is a huge agricultural establishment, 400 to 600 men, of course, piggeries, cattle, its own lumberyard. It's got a relationship to the salt works down in Kingston, because how do you preserve the meat, either for use on island or to send it back to Sydney? So the salt works as well plays a really central role in this. And thank you so much to all the people who let us go into their properties to look for this. So much of Longridge is still there. It's quite extraordinary, being used still, hidden behind other buildings, sometimes under people's buildings in their front yards. So very intact archaeology. I'd love to talk about Cascade, but that'll happen another day. But the other thing we're really interested in is these are not static sites. They evolve over time. Sometimes, you know, actually, usually as the next administrator comes along with their ideas, or as the next packet of letters turns up from England saying you're going to do this or whatever. So we think of Kingston as the landscape we see today, those big stone buildings. But what we've got to remember, that's a really late version of the site. Just to go back a little bit further, this is the site in 1829. Most of the large stone buildings just simply do not exist. Again, they're all 1840s or even later than that. We've been interested in the site of the original prisoners' huts, which are over near the swamp. Not the foundations you can see. They're actually just in front of that. We're interested in the stockades that are built around things like the garrison, which is behind what is now Government House, because they're terrified of convict uprisings, because if they're trapped here, they're goners. So they're really scared about that stuff. And of course, places like the jail, which are probably descendants of the original first settlement buildings, which weren't destroyed quite as thoroughly as I think the instructions said they were meant to be. So if we move very quickly, because otherwise Caiti's going to jump up and throttle me, in a nurturing and caring way. So what was first settlement? Well, unlike second settlement, which was a convict settlement, first settlement is a settlement with convicts. Now, you might argue that. You say, well, Australia was inherently a prison. No, the problem was the business of establishing colonies. They'd never done it before. That was the work of free enterprise. They'd give a patent to create a colony, but they didn't actually control it. So in the same way, you know, Sydney on the mainland was an experiment, and so too was Norfolk Island, to try to figure out what the relationship was between convict and free people, particularly as the convicts would eventually potentially turn into free people. Because in the US, when they sent America, the American colonies, it was an indenture system. without government interference. They simply basically sell the indenture of the convict onto the private owner. So they really don't know what to do in this situation. They're making it up. What I'm going to do, though, is throw to Dave Roberts, our historian, because remember, a big part of this is we don't just want to talk about places. We want to talk about the people in the places. So, Dave, would you like to come up and talk a bit about what you've been doing?
Thanks, Martin. Yeah, so for something completely different, I'm David. I'm the historian on the project team. I mean, we're all historians, but I have no archaeological pretensions or certainly no archaeological training. So anyway, look, I've worked on many components, small components of this project. And the one that I've been asked to look at tonight is our attempts recently to devise a directory of the Norfolk Island first settlement, which we all know what that settlement is. But this, we think, it's not the first attempt to identify all the people who were associated with that settlement, but we think it's the most comprehensive and extensive to date. What we're doing, of course, is setting up a means of tracing individuals through many, many different forms of records, many disparate and disassociated records. And we're setting up linkage systems whereby we can trace those individuals across records that are often designed for very, very different purposes. And that, of course, is enormous value to genealogists and family historians, and many of you have been doing that sort of work for a long time. But apart from that, we're also trying to platform a means of identifying larger sort of population patterns relating to this very, very eclectic settlement. We're trying to sort of think about social mobility and longevity and wealth accumulation and those sorts of things that come out of this early colonial enterprise. So we're setting up to look at the sort of shared experiences and backgrounds and outcomes of these people. We have in mind too, all this work that you're hearing tonight has very much at the forefront an idea that we're contributing to sort of public history and cultural heritage. We're wanting to assist descendants and community researchers to trace their ancestors, but we're trying to encourage public participation in historical discovery and interpretation. And that's especially important to the heritage and tourism industries, and that's our angle. And it underlines a lot of the work we're doing. I just want to note quickly too, as I always do, that a lot of our work relies on volunteers and students, or it draws heavily on the labours of volunteers and students. That's not to underestimate the enormous amounts of work that we put in when we should be having a work-life balance. But I speak to it because without them, we're indebted to them enormously, but also because that's part of our sort of collegial model as part of our mission at UNE particularly, and I think Caiti's bringing it to the University of Queensland as well. We're inviting public input into a sort of shared history enterprise. And what we do is we are very open with our findings. We make our work publicly available wherever we can. So it's a symbiotic relationship, and it's one that I just want to just sort of briefly stress. So what we're doing at this stage of the project is we're focusing on tabulated documents, which are obviously the most amenable to transcription into spreadsheets. You can see an original document up the top. That's a very fascinating set of Admiralty records, all the shipping that went to Norfolk Island and Port Jackson and then on to England. Anyone who was rationed on a government ship had their name recorded. And this is an interesting way of finding out who was being shipped to and from Norfolk Island and how much they were moving backwards and forwards. It's quite fascinating. But tabulated records are all we're working with at the moment, because they're so amenable to being converted into a database, as you see at the bottom of the screen. That's a sort of typical spreadsheet that we work with. But also because tabulated records at this time are the rage. The authorities really are trying to sort of surveil, control, and manage populations through tabulated data. And in our case, we've got something in the order of, sorry, can't be read, but the idea is to show you how many documents we've got. That's a small portion of them. We've got over 100 tabulated documents relating to the First Fleet settlement, the first settlement which began with the First Fleet. The extent to which these people were recorded through this sort of bureaucratic system is quite extraordinary, and that's just with the documents that have survived. Typically, these records are based on individuals because 19th century governance is increasingly relying on tracking personal identity and behaviour and movement, acquisition, etc. over time. Most of these tabulated documents are built around individuals, so they're heavily biographical. As I said, we've got over 100 documents which we're converting into spreadsheets. We've got as a result of this, the transcription so far, we've got about 23,500 rows of data relating to individuals on the first settlement, which is quite extensive. The challenge then, of course, is to reduce these down to unique individuals. So how many people are actually mentioned in these records? And that's not an easy task because we, as you know, we have so many individuals with similar names. You've got, mothers and daughters, fathers and sons, you've got aliases. There were 10 different people called John Smith, 9 called William Smith, 8 by the name of John Jones, and another 7 called Thomas Jones. So that's the sort of conundrums that we're dealing with when we're trying to work out who these records relate to. You have a John Abraham, who was distinct from John Abrahams, for example. Francis King and Frances King, who is a man and a woman, distinguished by a unique vowel in each of their names. So there's a lot of triangulation and cross-referencing involved, and this is our volunteers were very helpful with this. A lot of them descendants. It allows and just skipping on. I don't think I've got much time, but basically, so what we've done is we've created a directory with unique individuals, and it's kind of a work in progress. The more records we look at, the closer we look at the records we've got, we start to find that we've missed individuals, or that there are doubles that can be separated, or that there are individuals that we've recorded who are in fact 2 or 3 individuals. So it's forever a work in progress. But to date, the end result is quite remarkable. The population of Norfolk Island is believed to have peaked at around 1,150 around 1792 to 1794. But our archival research suggests that we have something in the order of 3,650 unique individuals who were associated with the first settlement in that time. That's over 26 years. And that's substantially more than the names and numbers that have been collected in prior studies, particularly Reg White's list of Norfolk Island residents, which he published in 1988, which listed 2,770. So we've found a lot more people who are in some way related to the settlement. And what that really reflects, 2 things. One is a preponderance of short-term visitors. A lot of these people aren't there for very long, but it's a much, much more fluid population than we thought. There's people coming and going from the first settlement, more than we ever believed, and that's quite significant. Now, what we do, of course, and this is a time-honoured tradition now, every time, you can see on the left, every time we find an individual, we give them a unique identifier number. There's no point identifying by somebody by name. They've got to have a precise number that no one else has. And so what we then do is we go through the record sets and we attach that unique identification number to each person's name. And what that instantly allows us to do without any great magic or technological wizardry at all is to pull up all the references to a particular individual in the data set. And you can see here using Edward Abbott, we've got, I know that must be about 14 or 15 different references to him in our database so far. So that's the most basic use of it, is to be able to construct some longitudinal studies of particular individuals, at least for the time they are on the island. That will be particularly useful to family historians, obviously, but we are also going to need something a bit more ambitious than this, and that's where we're going home to work on now. If we want to answer the sort of greater research ambitions that we have, we need to look at the population more holistically rather than as individuals. And that's going to require the creation of a probably not too sophisticated relational database, but the next stage of the data linkage process. We have already experimented with the use of AI technologies. We have a student who took data sets much like that, ran them through AI in order to create sort of short narrative biographies like you would get on a Wikipedia encyclopedia. That's a really, really exciting project. Fair to say it had mixed results. It wasn't always particularly successful, but these are the sorts of things we're working with. That database has been published online. There's a URL there which we can show again if you want to see it. But eventually what we're trying to do is sort of transform all these fragmented records into historical research that really advances sort of cultural heritage and broader public engagement. And so to fully realise the potential, we'll be going home to sort of get back onto our technology and our computers. So thanks for that. Now,
now the point to make is we're not Ancestry.com. We're not even the Biographical Dictionary of Australia. We don't need to make money out of it. Our KPIs, we will publish out of this. So we are going to make all this material, all these transcriptions available. We just need to sort of tart them up a little bit, if you like, to make them a bit more desirable. So don't think it's like, well, that's great. What's it going to do for us? Well, we want to give it back to you. So that's part of the quid pro quo of us coming in, working with the community is like, what are you interested in? You know, what can we actually provide for you as well? Now, back to the archaeology and the really interesting stuff. You'll also appreciate that, and how dare you call me a historian? Like, you take that back. All of those people, they live somewhere. They do something. They're not here to sit around. They all work. So the landscapes production punishment thing, even though it's a settlement with convicts rather than it's a convict settlement, the same sort of principles apply. Where are they working? Where are they living? What are the relationships between them? How are they producing? Remember, those relationships extend beyond Norfolk, and that's what Caiti will talk about in a sec. So we know these images, but with the exception of one building in there being the governor's house, and that's the early one, where are they? I don't mean like, well, there's somewhere here. Like, actually, as archaeologists, we need to know exactly where they are, because we might want to excavate it, but in the first instance, we just want to protect them, because we're not getting those sites back again. They get destroyed, they have gone. So, you know, you guys sit on an incredible heritage. So where are they? We look at the old maps. We understand the settlement is constantly evolving as well. And you'll all appreciate that the last decent plans and most of the drawings we've got stop just after 1800. Why? Well, my conspiracy theory is that because they're trying to start moving people off islands, there's an administrator saying, oh, all these legal cases, get me all the damn maps and da-da-da. And so probably all the later maps have been pulled out and given to someone in the colonial office because they're trying to push back against land claims and reimbursement and whatever else. We're not necessarily going to find all of them because a lot of them are not necessarily especially durable items, but we've got to give it a try. We can't go into the actual archaeology today. But the next thing, of course, is where is that industrial landscape? It's an agricultural settlement using the convicts as indentured labour. So a lot of these industrial processes are, of course, you know, available in some type of imagery, such as Lucas's Mills up in Arthurvale. Oops. But Caiti's going to talk to you about what is happening in that greater landscape. So if I hand to Caiti.
Thanks, Martin. Okay, so what I'm talking about here is this connection between all of those places all around Norfolk Island in the first settlement and looking at that period in particular. One of the tools that I'm doing that with is what Richard was talking about as well, is the GIS, the Geographic Information System, that kind of the mapping behind this project. And so just to briefly mention, part of the methods that we're doing here is what we would call georeferencing of those plans, where we get the historical plans and we put them back into the landscape. We put them back on the map. And to do that, we have to line up the features from that map with the real world in some way. And for these early sites, that's actually quite challenging, in part because the maps are not always accurate in terms of how they've been surveyed in. There's lots of quirks and differences in each of those, but also just in terms of the features you're picking to find to relocate those in the landscape. In these cases, there's not many features, there's not many solid buildings that still exist. And so we're using things, as you can see here, is the relationship between the creeks and streams across Norfolk Island and how they relate to those historical plans, which actually in lots of ways map together quite nicely, which is good. But just to note that there is inaccuracies in that level of detail. If you zoom in on that, there's a lot going on. It's messy data, but the idea is to stand back from this a little bit and to see this in a bigger way. So from that georeferencing process, what we can do next is digitize those features. So pulling out information, extracting that from that map, those historical maps, once they're on that landscape, really pulling that information out and examining it in detail. And so what you can see here where the blue arrow is the digitization process. We make little maps in which we pull out the shapes that are associated with these sites. So this 1793 map of the allotments across Norfolk Island. It has all of the allotments that have been leased or granted to different people across the island. And so using them as a vessel to understand where people are in that landscape. And so through that digitization process, we can then take off that base map of the original plan that we've used and just look at those allotments and overlay that with other information. So Richard mentioned the LiDAR before, and we've got that beautiful data here for Norfolk Island underpinning some of these maps, showing that kind of topographic landscape in lots of detail. But what you can see here is, again, there's this on the blue arrow here is selecting one of those allotments. You can see that we've attached to that place data about that place. So pulling in the historical work that Dave's been working on, all of that rich data, we have all those biographies, all of that history of those people, starting to embed that because we know that person was leasing or granting that land at a particular point in time. So making those connections between this. So this allotment at this point in time, at least had James Morrisby on it, and he was married with 4 children and was an ex-convict living on that side. So pulling that data into this as part of this process. What we can also look at, though, is for the 1790s period, at least, we have a nice series of maps that show change over time. So we can get this resolution of, rather than looking at individual maps, is tying them together into a bigger landscape. And so what we can see is the change over time, so that's 1793, 94, 95, and 96, showing that growth, that colonization of a landscape, and how different land uses are kind of being incorporated into that. You can see here I've kind of color-coded those in this instance by the pieces of land that are owned by the government, those that are held by free people or officers, or convicts or emancipists. And so we can start to color and visualize the maps looking at that kind of biographical data that we have about all those people. In fact, we can very easily then label those people in that landscape as well, showing who is there in those spaces at any point in time. But moving on from that, this analysis actually gets deeper into why we're doing all of this, which is thinking about the labor that we're talking about for the second settlement, how convicts are moving across that landscape. In the first settlement, we really have a lot of focus on agriculture, people living their own lives, both convict and free, and various combinations of that, people trying to sustain themselves. And so what we can see here is the mapping of the number of acres cultivated by individual people on each allotment. So the darker the color, the more acres of land they have. Up to 20 acres of land was cultivated in 1793. And what we can see from this visualization is the way that different pieces of land are being used, different efficiencies of agriculture across the site. And we can think about things like the environmental components of that, thinking about the aspect of the land or the soil quality or the water access they have. That's going to impact these kinds of results. And we can kind of put that environmental data into this as well and look at those sources together. But as well as that, we can also think about the social components of efficiency and labor and agriculture in this period. And so what this has done is showing that those allotments of the acres under cultivation, with whether the occupant of that land was an emancipist or a free person. And what we see is there's a visual correlation here. We haven't done more analysis on this yet, but the darker allotments are showing free settlers on those blocks of land. And convicts in general have a much lighter or therefore less land under cultivation for each of those blocks. So that's telling us potentially that we have higher productivity for the free settlers. And that may be dependent on the availability of labor to help them, potentially convicts working for those free people. But we can also think about other ways that convicts and their labor might be tied up in other spaces, and they may be unable to spend the time cultivating their own blocks of land. So there's a lot more there to unpack about who those people are and what data we have. There's a huge, rich range of resources we have about agriculture and a lot of other parts of the settlement that we can kind of overlay and look at spatially where things are happening, as well as tying in that environmental data into that. As Martin was talking about as well, we have across the landscape, this is showing it's moving out of that Sydney settlement and across the whole of Norfolk Island. We can actually see all the other settlements and those places as also as clusters of people coming together, little communities. So just thinking for a minute about Phillipsburg in the north of Norfolk Island there, we can look at that archaeological landscape, which is a reserve now. And these are some nice photographs that Robert Varman, he did some work across the 80s and 90s in this place in particular for the zoning plan. But and you can see here things like the freshwater source, the cascade itself, this lovely stone bridge that might belong to the first or second settlement, and that landscape as well that shows that space where Phillipsburg is likely to have been located in the first settlement and its association potentially with the flax industry in particular, and as a place where Marines or the New South Wales Corps was probably living as well. And so from that landscape, we can think about where are the people living in that space. We have this nice green landscape, as we saw here, this bushy vegetation. That was once a place, a hub of activity. A community was there in that space. And so reading that landscape to try and understand that archaeology a bit more. And Tom Sapienza has been doing some interesting work with viewshed analysis, looking at one of the only images we have of Philipsburg from the 1790s, showing this nice image here, and he's highlighted in red 2 of the houses. You can just see in yellow there a little bit of the road that you can see in that picture. And so doing some viewshed analysis, thinking about where that image was taken, putting that back on the map, and then visualizing where those huts must have been located based on that view. There's inaccuracies in this kind of work. We know these images have artistic license involved in that, but it's giving us a sense of where that community would actually be in the landscape. We can also think about the archaeology of these spaces and look for those archaeological signatures. One of the challenges we have, though, is what does the archaeological signature, what does the physical stuff look like for this period? And so looking at what has been dug elsewhere on the site, again, Robert Varman did lots of work across lots of Norfolk Island, but looking at the pier area report that he wrote for the trenching, the service works that were undertaken in the 1980s, you can see here this long, thin trench that went through the pier area. And from that work, we have found lots of artifacts. He found lots of artifacts. There's some of them on display in the commissariat store at the moment. And these are ceramics in particular that have are dated to this period in a way that they have a certain materiality and have certain qualities to them that make them recognizably different from that later material. So when we're out on site, and Robert Varman did a lot of this work too, identifying what is likely to be first settlement and what is later second settlement, so that we can kind of disentangle these different archaeological signatures across the site. But we, as well as artifacts, which we have some of those from this first settlement, we don't have a lot of understanding of the physical structures, all of those little huts we can see in those pictures. And so what we can do is turn to other places in which we have similar kinds of architecture and communities. And so what I've done here is comparing Norfolk Island to Parramatta. And this is contemporary point in time around 1805. We can see there are some differences in that landscape, as we know. The stone versus brick is one component of that. But there is some similarities in terms of the types of architecture, the arrangements of the houses, and the way they fit into that landscape. And what we can know is actually there's a huge amount of transfer of both people and goods between these 2 contemporary settlements. I've worked quite a lot as an archaeologist in Parramatta. And so for me, reading this landscape on Norfolk Island, I'm drawing those connections together and thinking about how they are similar places. And so this kind of comparative work becomes really important for our research going forward. And just to pause on that for a minute longer, we can think about some of the archaeology of Parramatta. This is kind of what it looks like. Less of the standing structures that you see down beautifully preserved in Kingston. Instead, we have these very ephemeral features. They're like splodges on the ground. The 2 top images are prior to excavation. This is literally one of those huts that you can see in those pictures there. But once you've excavated out those features, you can see post holes appearing. They're mostly timber structures, and so post holes are a critical part of that. But you can see on the other side of the screen, that's the chimney base. So a lot of these houses have chimneys, and so you get a C-shaped kind of notch in the ground where that chimney base was. We can expect at places like Philipsburg that we could get these kinds of features, but to excavate those or to find them, we're going to need to excavate a fairly wide, shallow area to expose those kind of features. Trenches and small excavation areas are not going to capture this detail in the way that we're doing it. So those kinds of things impact how we might think about understanding this archaeology in more detail. That is all from me. We might just get through this and have questions at the end, if that's okay. Yeah.
Okay, so what we want you to do is think, the archaeology is a document as well. The archaeology adds to a story. Not everyone was writing things down. Not everyone had a journal. Most of those journals, even if they were written, didn't survive. So for people like the convicts, actually many of whom were literate, this is their diary, if you like. This is a way of getting to that past. However, I'm not quite as high-tech as these 2 over here. I like to do it old school, and I just love looking at beautiful, early 19th, late 18th century pictures. So you'll all be familiar, for instance, with this one of Coimbra. And I think Lisa was actually with us when we made this discovery we're basically driving down the road because Robert, to his credit, I mean, he did say, oh, Queensborough's around here. It's up that part of the valley. We had a little bit of a discussion about that and agreed to disagree. I'm pretty sure that is that, which was heading towards the mission. So what's the road, Lisa? Douglas, yeah. So you can actually go up that bank where the cutting is and you can get the same view, which gives us a lot more confidence that we can use those images and documents to advance the possibility of finding examples of those places. The other thing which gives me a lot of hope, because you think, oh, everyone's found everything, is things turn up. I was absolutely not aware of this drawing until about 2 weeks ago. And there it appeared on Trove as a sketch from the back of, I think, King's Journal, just labelled Norfolk Island. It's not, it's Queensborough. It's those buildings are those buildings. Can you see the similarities? And I think they're the government buildings. So suddenly we've got this completely different view of a different part of the settlement. So if that can happen, what else might drop out of a tree? From these, of course, we can get a better idea of what that architecture was like. What were people building? We've got the written reports and King saying, oh, you know, the wooden buildings are all terrible. Yeah, but they're building them. So is there a chance of us finding them? Then there is this one, which we'll just close it. And I think it's probably my favourite picture. Turns up at auction in Bonhams in 2010. The house, or Mr. Slaney's house, Norfolk Island, latitude, blah, 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 circa 1800. In the English naive style, look at those horses. But when you get in there, and thank goodness, bought by the State Library in New South Wales, of the sorts of details of that architecture, it is that wooden, thick pine plank material. I don't think that's brick in that chimney, that's stone. Now, I know this is probably redone from a sketch from someone else. The windows are not glass, they're shutters. Glass is expensive. So again, there's a lot of reality. Also interesting when you looked at it was like, who the hell is that? Now, there's a bit of a debate with Caiti Dunn going on, and I think we decided the only Negro person we know who's around sort of in that time is John Caesar. But we're now not sure that it is him. But the question is that house in one of those villages? Or is it on one of those allotments? We don't actually know where anyone was living. That's a pretty big gap. Now, it may well be that in your backyard, there is something which may be indicative that you had one of these at your house. We don't know. And now we're not about to start charging into people's houses saying, we're archaeologists, show us your stuff. I mean, we don't do that. But we welcome people saying, I've seen something. Even if that something may have been damaged, destroyed, we'd like to know where those things are. So I'm not going to say anything else. I will hand back to Caiti. And I think, Carol, you've got a question?
What you've been talking about all the time is the male convicts and where they go to work or where they go to lunch or anything. Are you doing any research about the female?
Absolutely. Yep, we will. I mean, we're still sort of so new at doing the Norfolk material. And I've got to say, at one level, Rich and I are possibly a little bit too used to looking at male convict groups in Port Arthur because they're out doing that. But women, why not? They are part of that industrial labour force. They're part of the agricultural force. Is it 13 of them working in the flax factory, stripping the fibres and all of those sorts of things. So absolutely, they are on the cards. They are part of that economy. They become the wives of people or the consorts as well. So yeah, we have to write them into that landscape as well, for sure. Yep. Okay, I'll hand to Patty.
And I'll add to that too. The work I've been doing in Parramatta a little bit has been looking at women in particular, and the way that we join records together and find people. While a lot of the allotments in Norfolk Island actually has a number that are owned by women or primarily occupied by women, but finding the women associated with the men when the listings are about for grants and leases, what we can do by marriage records and other records of who is living with who is actually identify those women. And in Parramatta, we've had a lot of success at exposing that landscape of women just through pulling in that really fine-grained historical research and tying that to that spatial landscape and understanding where people are.
Can I add one thing? One other thing that we are doing, and we've got a very, we draw heavily on our students, as Dave said, and one of the things that, of course, we're training people in is things like transcription. Now, remember, UNE, the students are not at Armidale, they're distance ed students. So we do a lot of this stuff digitally because our students are 3,000 kilometres away, but by putting it online, they can share the resources. So one of them is transcribing all of the legal claims being made by First Settlement Norfolk Islanders against the Crown as they're being forced out to New Norfolk in Tasmania. And that's important because it says who owns everything, male, female, how much, to some degree where, all of those things, and Richard Slaney is a great example because we have this image, but we've also got the will which passes it on to another family and all of those details as well. So we're trying to sort of put together, in the way that Dave said, these relational data sets which will attach things like that, points on the land, artifacts necessarily, to actual people and bring them back to life within this sort of space. Back to Caiti. Sorry.
Do a little dance again. I think there are a few questions online, but I might have to try and, this thing's on the wrong screen. I'm going to work out how to get over there. My mouse over there? No, other way maybe. No, it was there. Okay, can't see.
Stop share.
Oh, yeah, good idea.
And you could close that.
And I
There
don't have my
are
mouse.
no questions just yet, Katie, but if anyone who's watching online would like to ask a question, just pop it into the chat.
Yes, thank you. Thanks. Am I still sharing?
No, but it's just a black screen.
Oh, okay. Oh, yes, I see. So I need to get out of that. Sorry, everybody. Stop sharing. I have to get back over to this screen again. This is a little bit, okay. Yeah, better. Yeah, does anyone in the audience have any questions? Other questions? Yeah, hello. Who was Mr. Slaney? Martin, would you like to take that? I've got to repeat the questions online.
Okay. Richard Slaney was Dave, you'll have to jump in here. He was a free settler. He was married to a young woman, Elizabeth, by the Reverend Richard Johnson, came across to the island, did a whole bunch of marriages. Presumably they lived in this particular house. She then dies about 4 years later, I think 1796, and he leaves the island in 1798. And I think he goes to Tasmania, but I'll have to double check because my mind has gone completely blank. Yes, he has a farm at number 23. So it's a good one because it's very, very close to Kingston. So this whole thing about who gets what land and overlaying those maps that Caiti showed you, things like the soil types, the hydrology, it's like who was getting what. He got a good bit.
The free settler could just choose to come and live here.
Yeah.
Without working for the government.
Yes, absolutely. And that's why it's not a convict settlement. It's a settlement with convicts. And yeah, so there is a point, of course, where Norfolk Island has more people than New South Wales because they evacuate them because they're starving. They bring them here. Then about a year later, they start to filter back. And that is why when the orders come that it just costs too much and we're going to abandon it, they don't want to go. Of course, they're going to fight it. And, pissed off people in the early 19th century, what did they have? A quill. Dear Governor, I object fulsomely to the forcible nature of yours, your obedient servant, whatever. Yeah, not so obedient. But that's the stuff this is the texture we're trying to add beyond the records that we've got, is that, yeah, these records are out there, but we need to get beyond the ones that we know really, really well in historical records of Australia and go back to the originals. Because even the other night, we were just comparing King's 1796 report, which gets back to the island, and he's like, I left here and I told them to do this, and they didn't, but they did something over there, and I do, and I don't like that. There are chunks missing from the original. Rich was just checking, and he go, you just like, there's a star here because there's several paragraphs about convicts, which they didn't publish. So the source that we all knew and loved isn't complete. So we've got to be really careful about that stuff. We do not know that we've got the full thing.
Okay, we have a question online, which is, are you able to say something about the developments of the productive landscapes over time, or similarities or differences across different regions?
Different regions of the island, Matt, or like?
Maybe you never know.
Not sure. So, well, look, it's going to depend. I mean, we're still gathering the information for Norfolk. Productivity, of course, is super duper important. We don't know that we, for first settlement, will get down to that level of detail for individual parts of the landscape. But we do know, for instance, there are statistics that are related to productivity at Queensborough versus Philipsburg versus Kingston. And I think Tom and I have been talking about this. There's a possibility that there were another couple of small settlements, one near Ball Bay and one near Anson Bay, which we never even realised. They may not have been big, but the government was considering they had a real existence as well. So I'm not sure that answered you, Matt, but...
sorry, the question was, I mean, if you've got a landscape that exists for 30 years or so, does that change? And how does it change in terms of its production levels or?
Oh, like, are you talking about, okay, so Matthew's question was, if you've got a landscape that's occupied for 30-something years, how does its actual productivity as a landscape change? So you mean like fertilization or land exhaustion? And
different cropping methods, different technologies, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, so again, it's something to be asked, and it will depend to some extent on what we can get from the records. But yeah, absolutely, this is the sort of thing we're interested in. It's not a single flat time period. The landscape and its productivity absolutely changes as people get to understand the seasons. Now, those archaeologists online, you'll understand there are, I was going to say the ghost of Judy Birmingham, but Judy's not dead.
Unkind.
This is the sort of stuff that Judy was interested in as well. So at the same time that Rob Varman was doing the work here, other colleagues at Sydney were doing slightly similar things. Do we have plans to undertake a walking tour? Sorry, the question vanished. Survey of the island. Well, we've got LiDAR for the island. Yes, at some point, but most of the island is private property. So, we will probably be asking people in select places, can we come and have a look? But not this trip. We will get to that. And particularly after Caiti's done her work, we'll know who to be charming to and ask permission as well. My question is about Norfolk Island's reputation as a punishment posting for the worst convicts. This is how many people see it. I'm sorry. Does it hold true if most people are decentralized farming working in smaller centres? Yeah, I think the reputation, it changes rapidly between administrators. I don't think most people understand that not necessarily the majority of convicts, but a hell of a lot of them are at places like Longridge and Cascade. They all think they're in Kingston. No, they are not in Kingston. There are times where Longridge has significantly more people than are in the central settlement. And then we got real reversals. So, second settlement, I was about to say Port Arthur, wrong site. Second settlement, Norfolk Island, it is a place of horror. And then you get McConaughey. And that's a massive ideological shift. McConaughey stops certain building programs. He tries to do other things. He takes the convicts out of those centralised situations, disperses them around the island. The British government decide they don't really like that, boot McConaughey, and then it changes back to a place of horror when you get child come in. So there's these ebbs and flows in how people are managed. Oh, Kathy, and hi, Kathy Dunn is actually online, so really lovely that you're there as well. And she says that the UNE Directory has the ownership of lands from different time periods from colonial 1788 to 1814. I'm going to hand back to Katie.
Okay, cool. Questions from the audience, yeah?
Yeah, a URL for those maps. Did you said you had something like that?
If you just look up convict landscapes, just type that into Google.
The convict landscapes will do that.
That'll
Yeah,
find- that'll
absolutely.
find it.
Yeah, so all those maps, just for those online, all those maps for the
And
convict landscapes.
Secondly, I'm living on Convict Road now
Yeah.
recently. But most of the extant archaeology seems to be in Bumbora's Road.
Yes, there is a very good question. I mean, Robert had various thoughts about that, but please, sorry.
So is there any archaeology you know about in Convict Road, or is it all just over the valley?
Well,
Do you want to stand?
sorry, probably this is something we're going out tomorrow to have another look. A lot of it was bulldozed away when the road was fixed. We can see and have actually with Lisa and Janelle, there were artifacts eroding out of the bank 10 years ago. So we are quite confident there is still archaeology, but probably what survives Long Ridge Road is on private property. I don't know whose land it is. We haven't quite got there. Sorry, Carol.
Side of the airstrip, which is nearest Branker House, there are foundations of the original hall.
Rawson Hall?
No, not Rawson Hall, was the one that was built in town, but there was a hall built there that was used as during the convict settlement as a hall.
Absolutely, and even more exciting and on our wish list, but not this time, because when we brought the ground penetrating radar in through Sydney Airport, they took our batteries away and threw them in the bin. So we've just like how much in excess luggage for that equipment? Like about $500 worth of excess luggage for equipment that we can't use this trip. Even more exciting, there's a military blockhouse on the airport land, built so that it could shoot the living hell out of the convicts in Longridge if they ever revolted, and shoot anyone coming up the Longridge Road as well. Those foundations, Tom's been avidly looking at crop marks. We're not sure whether it's just partly this side of the airport fence or actually right next to the runway, because we can't georeference. But there are all sorts of things that are really, really interesting and we could look at. But absolutely. Should I?
Yeah, questions online is, do you anticipate opportunity for additional excavation at locations of interest? First question.
Okay, the first one is, as much as we would love to excavate, I mean, there are existing assemblages excavated by Rob Farman. We would be absolutely remiss to get the trails out and dig more holes until we've dealt with the material we already have. This is a unique, irreplaceable resource. We have to be absolutely sure we know what and why before we touch trail to dirt. So yeah, we'd love to, but we're going to wait until we do this properly. New Zealand is part of the convict network. Yeah, look, particularly the military, they're doing laps of the British settlements. So there are lots of people from these places who end up being deployed. Same with Port Arthur, that they lose the military there because they go to the Maori Wars. That's why Port Arthur doesn't have military in the 60s, from the 1863. They're pulled out. But those are the same people. And Kerry, where does the Polynesian settlement fit in the research? We are aware of it, but there are only so many hours in the day. We're already trying to run a national project, and you could sit most of the project members around the kitchen table. So, yes, we are absolutely aware, but, retirement's less than 5 years away for me. I've got to achieve something in my life. So I'm narrowing it down a little bit. I'm going to step over there.
What about the land divided up into various sections? You said where it was fertile and where the waterways are. And is there any possibility, or you're focusing on the utilisation of waterways and where they may have dammed it or farmed it or cropped it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the kind of stuff, rather than excavation, that's the kind of things we can access, is looking at where waterways are, that kind of survey work, that kind of data, but we just haven't done that research yet. That is, so when I mentioned the potential for fertility of soil or water sources, that is a future direction I'd like this to go in, but it's going to take a lot of work to kind of to bring in those environmental sources and that information and that survey data into that network of information. So yeah, work in progress. But
yeah, but it's interesting because, you know, how we understand the water sources on the island today, of course, is completely different from the hydrology for first settlement or even second settlement. I mean, the airport changed a lot of things, cut off water courses, cut off, you know, runoff. Most of the sources say there was a lot more water because, yeah, it was running in different ways. So maybe those ribbon grants, those long, thin grants you see, which are a very traditional way of letting everyone have a little bit of the upper ground, a little bit of the slope, a little bit of the valley, and a little bit of the water. Maybe even though you say, well, the convicts get a chunk of the water, well, maybe that valley didn't really have water, or maybe the water was very good. So we don't really know. This is, again, the sort of information that we're hoping when we get around to transcribing things might start to drop out by people writing home and complaining, probably, or writing to the governor and saying, you know, I am outraged that convict got given something and I didn't get given something. We don't really know. We've got to get there, but we're aware of it for sure. Yeah.
Thanks everyone online for joining. Sorry, it is always hard to manage the real audience and the audience online at the same time. But thank you. That was great to see you all there. And thanks everyone for coming tonight. And thanks to the Knowledge and Learning Centre as well for hosting us.